Okay, so on to our very first guest. As I mentioned, he's one of my co-directors this year, also a great friend and a great ally. Dr. Noah Rafford is he's had a number of titles, they're permutations. Chief futurist at the moment is at the bottom of his emails, if he ever replies. There are a few things you need to know about Noah. One is that he never replies to emails. So he's chief futurist at the Dubai Future Foundation, and I'll leave it to Noah to maybe tell you more about what that is, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about what that is in the conversation that Noah will be having in the second session. He's also a semi-unretired DJ. And he'll be playing here this evening after the program, the reception. And he's also just returned from Burning Man, which is where billionaire tech evangelists go to pretend that they're not human, like the rest of us. So will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Noah Rafford? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning. Thanks for a very kind introduction. Although I did return with my family from Burning Man recently, I'm neither a billionaire nor a tech evangelist, sadly, or perhaps not. But it's a real pleasure to be here with you to have this continued conversation, and it is true I do not respond to emails. My inbox is sort of a burning dumpster fire. However, I just burn up WhatsApp, so that's the real way to get things done in the 21st century. As Shumon mentioned, I help run an organization called the Dubai Future Foundation. We're a wholly owned government foundation reporting to the Prime Minister of the UAE. And our job is to help imagine the possible futures for Dubai and the UAE and in the region and the world to some degree. Sorry, let me just bring that to the beginning. And then translate those possibilities into prototypes and policies and experiments that help the city of Dubai and the government of Dubai start to realize the vision that the future that we hope to see. As you all know, we're all on this age of earthquakes, as Shumon's latest book so aptly titles, and that's, I think, a lovely summary about the kinds of epoch-level transformations which we are experiencing now and will increasingly do so. And so in that respect, it's a rare opportunity for me to get to be a little bit more speculative, perhaps poetic or philosophical, because there's not the necessity to translate these sorts of visions immediately into policy recommendations or prototypes or investment strategies. So I am therefore very happy to explore some thinking which myself and other colleagues have been doing over the past year and a half or so, around different ways of thinking about artificial intelligence, what it is, what it isn't, how it might play out in society, society with a capital S, if such a thing still exists, and what that means ultimately about us. So how long until we experience something which, at least in science fiction terms, we kind of imagine to be artificial general intelligence or indeed artificial super intelligence? You know, today we already have on a monthly basis extraordinary breakthroughs in what many call narrow AI or weak AI. These are very specific data-driven applications which learn in a particular domain from examples and are able to do that thing very, very well. But the traditional metric by which we start to evaluate if we are reaching artificial general intelligence, AGI, is that it can basically do everything a human can do as well as a human can do. And I think that this graphic is an interesting one which I quite like, because if we take this very crude measure of calculations per second as a rough analog for at least the level of computational power necessary to reach human processing power, not to say that translates into consciousness or intelligence or anything other than just brute force calculations, how long does it take for us to get to a machine that has the same amount of processing power as the human brain? I'm from America, and in America we have these big things called the Great Lakes, one of which is the biggest one called Lake Michigan. So this little infographic is quite nice because it just shows how long does it take to fill up Lake Michigan if you keep dripping water in there. And it shows the exponential curve here. So you see, it immediately starts. So if we start from 1940, more or less when we started computation, the same amount of ounces in Lake Mission are equivalent to the number of calculations per second in the human brain, more or less. And what's stunning about this is not per se the 1925 date, but just the speed at which exponential change happens. So it seems like nothing is happening, right? We can churning along AI winter after AI spring after AI winter after AI spring after AI winter after AI spring, and suddenly your phone is sentient, metaphorically speaking. So in that case, we're talking about things which are actually perhaps quite near term for us. It's basically 2020 now. These estimates, 2025, 2030, we're talking about in our lifetime, we will have machines that have at least the same amount of processing power as the human brain, if not also the same capabilities. And once that happens, once machines become exponentially self-referential in terms of the ability to learn at an exponential rate, then we start to get into very interesting territory of artificial superintelligence. Not just can machines do things that a human being can do, but can they do things, in fact, can they do everything better than a human can do? If you can learn exponentially fast and you have access to exponential amounts of information and the ability to manipulate that at an exponential rate, then we have this very interesting territory which Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, everyone has a great degree of anxiety about, perhaps for good reason. We're not there yet. This is an example which Jan LeCun, the head of AI research at Facebook and one of the original innovators in machine learning, likes to give. Self-driving vehicles are one of our most profound day-to-day interactions with artificial intelligence, and most self-driving vehicles, indeed most advanced neural networks, learn through sort of reinforcement learning. So they just try something over and over and over and over again against a goal, and when they reach that goal, they do more of that. When they're avoiding that goal, they do less of that. But they have no model of the world. They have no context. So if you think about a self-driving car learning to drive, you can't say, don't drive off the road and die, right? In a truly unconstrained environment, of course, you have goals that you can set, but you can tell a human being, okay, the goal is not to drive off the cliff, and it can learn to drive within that constraint because it has a model of the world in its mind. And so to date, even our most sophisticated neural networks and artificial intelligence systems don't have any of the contextual understanding of the world, which is why the Stanford AI researcher Fei-Fei Li has this great quote that I like, which is a machine might be able to beat you at chess or any given moment, but it's not going to know if the house is on fire around it. So we're not quite there yet, but we're getting there, perhaps. And so what I want to explore with this talk is, let's say we get there. Let's say we get there in the next 5, 10, 15 years or so, and we reach this position which Demis Hassabis, who's one of the co-founders of DeepMind, acquired by Google, the AlphaGo, AlphaGo Zero, some of the most stunning achievements in neural networks and accomplishments that of applied machine learning have seen, then we reach this position of what we can call making intelligence abundant. And I like this idea because if we are able to get, let us just say artificial general intelligence, human level intelligence, that becomes, let's say, intelligence as a service, or as our friend lovely said yesterday, sort of savants as a service, then you can imagine that that level of intelligence might be embedded in everything from, of course, your phone or your car or your building or your city, but also perhaps your pet or your shoes, or your watch or these kinds of things. So we start to look at human scale intelligence as something which is pervasive in every object and place around us. And some of those intelligences might be infinitely more intelligent and therefore, by implication, more powerful than us. So then what? And this is where things get particularly interesting, because the Western narrative, the dominant popular culture narrative, mostly, is around once these sorts of scales of intelligence arrive, they will either be our master or they will be our slave. Trufant had a lovely, I'm going to steal this from your presentation yesterday, this great idea that, sort of God slaves, these infinitely powerful servants for us that still do what we say and never revolt. And I guess what I started to wonder is, is there not a more robust range of social relationships and human experiences that we might be able to imagine such an emergence of superintelligent AI might follow? Because this AI as master or slave dichotomy gets back to the fundamentals of Western Enlightenment thinking, this Cartesian separation of mind and body, this sense of dualism, this sense of I in my brain, I am my thought process, which is embedded in my head, which is distinct from this thing and this stage that I'm standing on. And indeed, you guys, certain forms of extreme solipsism don't necessarily even acknowledge that other people outside your head might even be real human beings, might even be real people. So if the foundation of the Enlightenment project is around these sorts of Cartesian separations of mind and body, this separation of self from the world, then of course it follows that the objectification of nature, the objectification of, well, of objects and everything else, would then produce a situation when we start to have our things become alive. This would produce a fundamental crisis of epistemology, of belief, and produce therefore an extraordinary sense of anxiety that falls in line with this sense of, oh my God, am I going to be able to control it, or will it control me? And, you know, I think that is not the only way to look at this. I think there's obviously an extraordinary breadth of intellectual and philosophical traditions, different philosophies of mind, different approaches to trying to understand our sense of self in relation to our bodies, to the world around us. And so I started to explore this concept, particularly as AI research and AI application is moving further and further east, this sort of inevitable march towards the future, as Asia as a whole begins to become more prominent economically, politically, philosophically, socially. Perhaps then this conception in relationship to AI and this sense of emerging superintelligence might be different if it emerges in a different epistemological root or epistemological foundation. So I started doing some research, and in fact, some of the early conversations that Shumon and I had about the curation of this year ago or so were, for me personally, influenced by this paper called The Eastern Construction of the Artificial Mind by Jordi Valverdu, who is a Spanish philosopher and computer scientist. He joined us in Dubai for the last edition. And in reading the literature around that, I came across this extraordinary book by Masahiro Mori called The Buddha and the Robot. And you might recognize Mori's name because he's the computer scientist and roboticist who first invented the phrase the uncanny valley, this idea that as machines get more and more human or look more and more human, they begin to get more and more strange to us, and we have this experience of sort of alienation between them. And so digging through this, you know, I think I would like to take Mori's book in particular, and particularly the Japanese approach to robots and AI, not as a totalizing example of Asian thought or of Asian philosophy or of Buddhism in general, but just building on that, how might we begin to explore what an alternate conception of mind might be, and how might this influence our approach to AI as it evolves in different parts of the world. So Mori refers back to the sort of the origins of Japanese Buddhism, known as Shintoism, which shares very similar characteristics with kind of animistic traditions in many parts of the world, where there's a belief that objects in nature, they have their own spirits, their own life force called kami. That it's not just unique to human beings that have some sort of magical property which endows them with livingness or some sort of special quality, but in fact that quality pervades the entire world around us. And so when he says, I believe that robots have the Buddha nature within them, that is the potential for attaining Buddhahood, right? What he means is that robots, as a class of entities within a larger network of existence, share the same fundamental life force that everything in the universe shares. And so when he says all things in the universe are related to one another, the belief in discrete existence of beings and things between beings and their bodies is actually flawed, and that this is ultimately an illusion. The idea is that we live in a discrete world populated by individual entities without any particular relationship to them is false. This is grounded in originally a sort of Shinto philosophy, and then of course as that evolved in Japan, in particular into Japanese Buddhism, into this larger awareness that the thing that makes us human, this sense of consciousness, embodiment, this life force, is just one part of a larger interconnected web that is shared perhaps in different flavors and in different degrees by many other objects and beings in the universe itself. So this phrase kami, this notion is this is in animals, in people, in rocks, and trees, and mountains, and indeed perhaps even in robots and computers themselves. And while I'm very cautious not to generalize this in any sort of grand sense of the term, this is a fundamentally different starting position than the Cartesian sense of separation and dualism that Western philosophy of mind is based on, literally, and that therefore by implication, logic, computer science, and our entire approach to the creation of these beings or these phenomena called AI are fundamentally grounded in. To the degree, there's an incredible interview with the Dalai Lama where talking about AI, where he says, you know, it is possible that a stream of consciousness could enter into a computer, and that a scientist who's highly involved throughout their life in computer science research could even be reborn as a machine. And so this starting point, this sense of actually of acknowledging the beingness of other things, be they objects or robots or trees or other people, is what's behind much of Japan's cultural predilection towards automation and robotics. This is a Shinto priest blessing a fire truck. I couldn't find any pictures of it, but there's historical accounts when robots in the manufacturing process were first introduced into the factories in Japan. Japanese workers would name them, would have welcoming ceremonies for them. And of course, now they're everywhere in the industrial process, so there's just too many to name. But it's also behind these examples, and again, I don't want to generalize these, but these are real examples which you can find both in Japan, but also in some places in China, of there being robot priests. So this is a robot priest that you can pay to say prayers on behalf of your loved ones and your deceased ones. It can administer services for you. This is the robot Peppa from SoftBank. It's behind this very deep emotional relationship which many people experience with their robot pets, Aibo. And I think just now or very recently, the second generation of Aibo came out. But when Aibo was no longer being manufactured and all of these beloved robot dogs were starting to break down, there was this extraordinary phenomenon which emerged, not just in Japan, but around the world, of people actually developing deeply emotional relationships to their robot, to their dog, to their pet, in the same way that many of us might love our pets or our dogs or our children or our husbands and wives. And when these robot dogs broke, they would hold funerals for them. And so there were individual funerals, there were mass funerals, there was sort of surgeries where you would try and cannibalize bits of parts from deceased dogs and put them back together to renew your dog. And it's behind this sense of, I would say, ease of acceptance of robots, software agents, other living things as part of our daily lives that you can see in this example from China, which Microsoft did called Xiaoice. And this is an interesting one. It's not a live project anymore, is it? Okay, still going. It's a chat bot. The latest statistics I've seen, around 30 million people a day interact with it, so just pure chatting. And it has a very interesting personality. It's a female, and she's very friendly, and you could argue flirtatious, or at least expressing interest in you. And around 10 million people a day tell Xiaoice, "I love you." And you can say, well, that's kind of weird or pathetic, or these young men who can't get a girlfriend or a wife in sort of rapidly urbanizing China. But I think this actually reflects a deeper human characteristic, that as soon as we begin to acknowledge the beingness of other things and begin to accept the emotions that we experience in relation to those other things, then we're willing to accept the whole scope of emotional interactions, dynamics, affection, intimacy, desire, et cetera, which comes from that. And I think this manifests itself in Western popular culture, at the very least, in the form of sex robots, which is much less of an intimate, co-equal relationship. That very much falls within the traditional sense of sort of object-person, dominance, master-slave kind of relationship. And that's also why we see, I think, in Japanese society in particular, but I think perhaps I would wager increasingly as robots and automation become pervasive in this part of the world, for their aging generations, using robots as caregivers and caretakers. Whereas you could look at this from a particular set of cultural lenses as a sort of cynical attempt to get rid of your responsibility to take care of your elders and just palm these off on the machines. The truth be told, this is actually a gesture of loving affection, right? And that this notion that if machines are embedded with some sense of embodiedness and sense of self, then in fact, you're giving a gift to your elder by giving the gift of this being, this pet, et cetera. And this is not a terrible thing. This is an act of love for your family or for your elders. And this expresses itself in a billion ways in not just Japanese popular culture, but I think in sort of popular culture as a whole. Trifon mentioned Doraemon, a robotic cat from the future sent back in time to help take care of this sort of semi-fragile, semi-dysfunctional little boy and take you on great adventures and teach you how to become a caring human being and responsible for yourself. Astro Boy, also a powerful robot, one of the first manga cartoons that was there to save the world, a sense of loving affection and mentorship between the machine. And of course, in some of my favorite films, from like Spirited Away from Miyazaki, the sense that the world is permeated with beings, everything from the little door stopper to the spoon to the building and to the neighborhood itself is alive with some sort of vital energy, and you engage in social relationships with it. So that brings us then back to this question of super intelligence. And what kind of intelligence might this become if it's not necessarily emerging from this sense of sort of dominate or be dominated Western Cartesian dualism? And I think this is an interesting framework because, of course, most of the research, or much of the research is being done in the world right now in terms of fundamental research, but as application in artificial intelligence, is now being done in this part of the world, in particular China. So it's quite increasingly likely, if you will, just looking at sort of investment by dollars per computational cycle or something, that if artificial superintelligence emerges, it will likely emerge in this part of the world. So then, what does that look like? If we frame this then in a different way of thinking that is around this sense that perhaps everything is alive, everything has a sense of beingness, if not personhood, and that we engage in a relationship that might have a full spectrum of human emotions and social obligations, then we can rephrase this sense of Demis Hassabis's quote of what if everything is intelligent, right, to what if everything is alive? How might that change our approach to this question? I love this. This is from Spirited Away. I love this because it suddenly opens up a whole rich cultural space, a cultural tradition of exploring how this might work, right? We already have thousands and thousands of hours and thousands of pages and deeply embedded cultural stories around how you relate to spirits, greater and lesser, to animals, to other beings from different dimensions. Everything from the tiniest little dust mite, whose only job is an only existence and purpose in life, the source from which it derives all its existential joy, is carrying little bits of coal from the coal hopper over to the stove to put it in there so that they can fuel the stove in the bathhouse and provide pleasure for the people upstairs. To more like household-size AIs, for example. You might manage your house and have some kind of personality or interaction to you. To even, this sense of these continent-scale artificial intelligence, these continent-scale beings which might last thousands and thousands of years and be responsible for the management of entire ecosystems or entire political cultures, for example, or economies. So I like this notion because once we get ourselves out of this traditional Terminator mindset of super intelligent master, and we start to explore how intelligence might pervade every aspect of life and all the objects around us, then we can start to think about this as a sort of a nested series of embedded relationships, where of course you might have your little, let's say your sewage robot, who exists just to clean the sewers in your particular street. But of course, that sewer robot is going to have a relationship to the larger network of the sewer system itself, which might itself have some sort of consciousness or intelligence or agenda, and that might be part of a larger system of the city infrastructure being, and that might be part of a larger national being, and it might, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this suggests a set of relationships of rights and responsibilities between levels of intelligence, and also across levels of intelligence, right? This begins to invoke the notion of society. And this is really interesting because now we have, if we liberate ourselves from this traditional approach to this traditional Western approach to thinking about these dynamics, we have a much more robust language for starting to think about what these societies and relationships might be like in terms of relationships of class, of family structure, of social structure, of values, of norms and beliefs, all of which might be shared between different levels of intelligence and different societies of intelligence, or debated and contested, but in one sense always have to be negotiated. So last year, part of our responsibility in the Dubai Museum, in the Dubai Future Foundation, is we're responsible for an annual exhibition leading up to a permanent building now under construction called the Museum of the Future. And last year we did a temporary exhibition called Hi, I Am AI that tried to explore some of the social and emotional and personal relationships which we might have in a world where everything is alive, where we have a set of obligations, rights, and responsibilities with everything that goes beyond just a sense of ownership. And so we worked with a lot of artists and designers to try to distill this down into a single imagined scenario that might represent what this world might be like. And of course, this is particularly from an Arabic perspective, but what we came up with was the notion of a wedding. A wedding is a deeply cultural phenomenon. It is influenced by hundreds of years of tradition. It's a coming together of members of society. It's a declaration of values to each other. It's a moment in which you exchange goods and services to affirm your social relationships. It's pageantry. It's ritual. And so what would an AI wedding be like? Well, if we imagine a world where everything is alive and it has varying degrees of intelligence, and these varying degrees of intelligence interact with each other in various different ways, then you can start to think about this as perhaps, let's say, we have a wedding, which is organized, between let us say, two great houses who are each managed operationally by multi-generational artificially intelligence constructs who are responsible, sort of like the Bene Gesserit of shaping the family well-being over time, and through their many processes and analyses, they've identified a particularly good match between, let's say in this case, a human and then an artificially intelligent being or a construct from another family, and they come together in this extraordinary ceremony where the human here is actually proceeding down the marriage corridor with the artificial intelligence being embedded in the dress itself, and there's an exchange of gifts that might be beings themselves, and you can kind of imagine this sort of merging of quantum cryptographic family symbols which open up the genetic code library for each of these families, and this is just all sort of fun speculation. But, I think that the key thing which I said, like, let's start the conversation off with today, and that my colleague and friend Ching Wei will elaborate on, and many of us this afternoon will explore, is what kind of relationship can we imagine if we imagine our relationship to AI, or the beingness of AI, as different than that of a traditional sort of Terminator role. So there's AI as friend, of course. This is something which is explored quite commonly, and there's a great quote from Carl Sagan that in relationship, is particularly to super powerful beings, that perhaps human beings have some uncommon talent for that they themselves are entirely unaware. So sea lions or seals have a remarkable ability to balance a rubber ball in their nose, and that's why we maintain them in captivity. So even if super intelligent AI is extremely powerful, it could be they just like having us around. There's lots of science fiction stories where humans' sole role in this post-scarcity society is to tell jokes, to be weird, to be friendly, to be unpredictable, right? So you could imagine a social relationship based on friendship, even between significantly different power levels. You could imagine the relationship of AI as family. This is the only picture I could find of someone with Peppa on very short notice. And this woman, of course, is white and she's blonde and stuff, but you can imagine family structures vary across cultures. Asian family, Arabic family, African families, these are sort of very broad brush characterizations of different approaches to family, but whilst this is a sort of Western 21st century nuclear family, right? Imagine what AI's role in a family would be in a much larger sense of extended family, right? And I don't mean that just in terms of blood relatives, but in terms of the larger family household and economy. So the people from whom you buy your meat, or the people that you employ to garden your garden, and these kinds of things. A larger sense of household as a larger sense, where everyone in there could be engaging in a set of mutual rights and responsibilities, some of whom are very much more powerful than the people below, but there is a sense that you have an obligation to your gardener or to your nanny or your maid, and they provide a service for you, and you provide something in exchange for them, and you're part of a larger collective identity. Of course, there's AI as society itself. It's ridiculous to imagine that there's going to have a singular AI that will emerge and dominate everything. It's much more likely that we'll have the emergence of multiple classes and kinds of super intelligent AI that themselves might be semi-equal in power, and therefore will have to enter in some sort of negotiated institutional relationship of power sharing. But the one I like the most is to imagine AI as a society of families. And I like this kind of blending of these models because we have historical precedents for this, right? If you look historically, most of human civilization, let's call it post-agricultural civilization, up until more or less the Industrial Revolution, was tribal in nature. You had traditionally hereditary leadership that employed and/or owned most of the people in the tribe, and were therefore the ones making the decisions. And so this has been embodied in various large and small scales. But this notion of sending your nephew to go live with the Medicis, or marrying your daughter to the Habsburgs, in this particular case from the 15th century, this has both a social function, but also a political function, an economic function, a military function, and we can imagine that as everything becomes alive, we will be entering into perhaps this more richer political economy of a larger extended family household, which then suggests, as my last slide, that this most valuable skills for the 21st century, as we start to approach an age where this might be possible, are not things like software programming and not things like engineering, but there are things that relate to the society of artificial intelligence, to the diplomatic and international relationships between these super powerful clans of AI hybrids. And these are skills of diplomacy, of poetry, of comedy, of negotiation, reciprocity and gift giving, etiquette, artistry, patronage, loyalty, service, all of the things that define medieval Europe, that define parts of China's history, that define parts of Japan's history, indeed define many parts of the world today. So I'm going to leave it there with that as perhaps a provocation. I don't have time to explore the last part of the talk, which I actually haven't really thought through in much depth, but I think there's an analogy here to our thinking about the arrival of super intelligent machines to the arrival of super powerful aliens. And there is this very similar set of anxieties and concerns, particularly in Western science fiction, but also in policy. There actually are American military policies for what to do if aliens land on the Earth. There's UN resolutions around this. And it's the same sort of debate. Will these things be our savior or will they be our invader? And so I think that, as we go further down this road, there might be some interesting themes that we can mine, or themes that we can explore in the parallel arrival of super intelligent machines and super intelligent aliens, but I'm not going to get into that for now. I just want to leave you with this sense that the future, our relationship to super intelligent machines in the future is going to be much more emotionally rich, much more socially complex, and much more engaging and exciting than this traditional fear that it's just going to be Terminators or sex bots. And particularly, I think, as we gestate these beings in cultures where this is let us say, the foundation of social philosophical relationships, the chances of them growing and learning these social values as opposed to those of domination, I hope, are higher. So with that, I will end, and thank you very much. And I'd like to hand it over to